Next, we have a speech by Sardar Ahmad Sahib, and the topic of the speech is the Holy Quran, a life-giving promise. Sardar Ahmad Sahib.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Walaikum assalam.
Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa nashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'uzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. 1400 years ago, Mecca had a huge party. Drums and tambourines played throughout the city, and literally for weeks, people sacrificed camels, all because of the birth of one boy. As that boy grew up, he was praised for his generosity, his intelligence. He became the chief of one of Mecca's most powerful tribes, and he also had a loyal son. Many times in his life, he said about the Holy Quran and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that I swear I know what he says is correct. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam once even promised him that if you were to accept the Holy Quran, you would humble the Arabs and dominate the non-Arabs. Naturally, when people heard this, they asked him, are you going to convert? Are you going to accept Islam? But that question would make him grow furious. And he'd say, no, because if I did that, my tribe's legacy would die. That man was Abu Jahl. It's weird, but it's true. And it's true because human beings have an uncanny ability to convince themselves that our beliefs are correct, even when we know they're wrong. In psychology, this disconnect is called cognitive dissonance, and it's something man has always suffered from, even when it involves a promise from God. We might say that Abu Jahl's logic is a classic cognitive dissonance. It's that disconnect. We might say that the way Abu Jahl looked at the Quran is the way the Quran itself says, وَمَا يَخْدَعُونَ إِلَّا أَنفُسَهُمْ وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ, that they deceive none but themselves, وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ, but they perceive not. But sometimes we forget to ask ourselves if we really believe in the Holy Quran, or if we also suffer from a disconnect like Abu Jahl. So what do I mean? A couple examples. Sometimes a good life can make us suffer from a disconnect. We can believe that because we got into a good school, we have a good job, if we're retired, we come home to a peaceful home, that we've gotten this far without really paying much attention to the Quran. So it's okay to keep going. But Abu Jahl also had a good life, at least for a while. So a good life just isn't that promising a marker. And besides the good life, we forget sometimes that there's also an afterlife. And some people here may have a disconnect about that afterlife. Maybe we're not as certain about the afterlife. But if that's the case, the Quran itself gives an argument. In chapter 22, verse 6, it says to look to your first life. The point is that there was a time when you were just a fetus and you had no conception, no awareness of this life. Is it really that hard to believe that this can't happen again? Other times, we let the modern world create a disconnect. Instead of looking to the Quran for guidance, we say, let's see what some tech pundit said, what some scientists said, because we think modernity is promising. But it's really not. Think about the fact that we buy billionaires' products, but not billionaires' morals, because we know that many of their personal lives are a mess. And as far as scientists go, one study demonstrated that up to 75% of lab experiments produced unexpected results. But scientists actually ignored those results precisely because it violated their core beliefs. And while this was happening, they also found out that the area of the brain responsible for cognitive dissonance was activated. And it's not something that just the average scientist suffers from. For example, Isaac Newton, we all know the name, and we all know he definitely helped create the modern world. But for 3 decades of his life, he also tried to prove and validate alchemy. Other times, that disconnect can actually appear noble. We can tell ourselves that we pay our chanda, we volunteer our time for the Jamaat, maybe we volunteer our time for this Jalsa, and we didn't give that much attention to the Quran, so it's okay, at least we did something even if we didn't do something else. But about this type of logic, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih Rabi rahimahullah once said that if our religious efforts don't create a love for the Holy Quran, wo koshishe bekar hain. Such efforts are useless. As the Quran itself says, zayyana lahumu shaitanu amalahum, that Satan made their works appear good to them. Lastly, we might tell ourselves that it's okay to give up on the Quran or slack on the Quran because it's hard. It's not our native language, we didn't grow up with it. So it's okay if we don't give it the attention it deserves. But that just ignores the fact that that hardship is actually a good thing. Because the hadith says, such a person who exerts himself to learn the Quran by heart and recites it with great difficulty will have a double reward. And really this sounds something like a disconnect that Abu Jahl suffered from. Because one night he got curious about the Quran. He saw what was going on in Makkah and he said, I have to check this out for myself. So he snuck out at night and sat outside the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam just so he could listen to tilawat. He'd spent the entire night there sacrificing his sleep. And he did this for 3 consecutive nights. Now obviously it didn't change his mind. But the point is that if we give up on the Quran because it's too hard, we should also ask ourselves if we've tried at least as hard as Abu Jahl. So far, we've talked about how we give up on the Quran because we think life's okay. But what about when it's not? What about when things get hard or when we think we've done such bad things that the Holy Quran can't help us? When despair creates a disconnect. If that's what you're going through, then you should look at how the Quran saved the life of Hazrat Ikrama, Abu Jahl's son. Ikrama was Abu Jahl's firstborn, and the two were so close that at Badr, of all the people that Abu Jahl could have picked as his right-hand man, he picked Ikrama. It's recorded that Ikrama fought in every ghazwa, every battle that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ fought in, he fought as a non-Muslim in. And instead of listing out his crimes, it's easier to say that at Fateh Makkah, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam once announced that of only 6 people that must be executed, Ikrama would be one of them. Now imagine the man's mentality at this point. His father's died, his friends have died, his friends keep converting. Makkah has now been conquered, and even now he's not even granted a pardon, he's going to be executed. So he did what anybody else in his position would do. He fled all the way to the Red Sea, and as he was about to board his ship, his wife caught up with him. And his wife told him 2 things. One, she told him that he had been pardoned, he had been forgiven. But the second thing she said was that she pointed out the disconnect he was suffering from. She said, don't you know that the person you're running from is the perfect embodiment of the Quran? Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Who knows how many contradictory thoughts must have gone through his mind at that time. But ultimately, he got over his disconnect. And he made the trek back, about 60 miles across barren desert, about a day's journey by foot. And when he entered Makkah, Rasulullah ﷺ was so happy to see him that when he stood up, his cloak fell off. And with his arms wide open, he said, Marhaban bi Raqibil Muhajir. Welcome, O traveling rider. Rasulullah ﷺ calling Ikrama Raqib al-Muhajir or a traveling rider is very instructive, very informative. Because Hazrat Masih Maud says that someone who truly repents is like a muhajir. He's like someone who abandons his homeland and never returns, never looks back. So if life is tough, don't give up. Don't use that as an excuse to give up on the Quran. Use it to keep going forward and be granted a new life. And this is what the Quran itself says. Qul ya ibadi allazina asrafu ala anfusihim la takunatu min rahmatillah inna allaha yaghfiru dhunuba jami'a innahu huwal ghafurur rahim. Say, O my servants who have wronged their souls, despair not the mercy of Allah. Surely Allah forgives all sins. Verily He is most forgiving, merciful. And Ikrama actually did this. Even after he converted, he was teased and bullied by some people because of things his father had done. And it got so bad that it even upset Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he didn't give up. And he became so pious that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entrusted him with tax collection. And the Khulafa entrusted him with being a general. And he developed such a deep love for the Quran that it said that he would pick up the Musaf, put it to his face, kiss it, and while weeping he would cry out, Kitabu Rabbi, Kitabu Rabbi, that this is the book of my Lord, this is the book of my Lord. And the Qur'an transformed Ikrama so much that he earned a very rare compliment from Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam, a compliment we all wish we could get. Addressing the entire Jamaat, Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam says, "Ab dekho कि कहाँ से कहाँ तक हालत पहुँची कि बार बार वहाँ में से याद किया गया। मेरी नसीहत यही है कि हर शख्स इन अखलाक की पाबंदी करे." Just observe the heights to which Ikrama reached, where again and again he is remembered with praise. I advise each and every one of you to adopt these morals. And just to contextualize his transformation, remember that Ikrama spent almost 3 decades of his life opposing Islam. He converted at 32 and he passed away at 36. So he spent almost 90% of his life in jahalat. The point is that to everyone here, it's almost never too late. Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salam says, इंसान को ये कभी ख्याल नहीं करना चाहिए कि ऐसे मर्तबा हासिल होना नामुमकिन है. ये सब कुछ मिल सकता है और मिलता है. One should never think that it is impossible to attain such a lofty station. All this can be acquired and is acquired. And science agrees. The data actually shows that if you were to improve by 1% daily for 1 year on any task you were doing, by the end of that year, you would be almost 38 times better at that task. And if you were to degrade, similarly, if you were to degrade by 1% over that same year, you would be at the end of the year almost at a 0. And that 1% is the difference between someone who honors the Qur'an like Ikrama or who ignores it like Abu Jahl. Incidentally, this 1% phenomenon highlights another disconnect we may fall victim to. And that is that when the Qur'an promises that something will happen, it can take time for it to happen. And in that interim time, we fall victim to a disconnect. We say something's wrong, it's taking too long, something doesn't add up, it doesn't work. That disconnect starts to creep in. But we forget that if that promise is true, that interim time actually adds power to that promise. Legacy is why Abu Jahl rejected the Qur'an, and it's why years later he fought at Badr. But the irony is that at Badr, his tribe suffered so badly that Meccan power actually shifted from his Banu Makhzum tribe to Banu Abu Shams. And Abu Jahl himself died a disgraceful death, because in his last breath, this is what he knew. He had been taken down by teenagers, his leg had been chopped off, his loyal son had abandoned him, he would be denied the death of a warrior, and most importantly, he found out from Abdullah bin Mas'ud that Islam had won. And later that evening, after Abu Jahl's body, his corpse had been thrown into a well, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam called out to him, and he said, "O Abu Jahl, have you found what your Lord promised to be true? Because I have found what my Lord promised me to be true." And Allah Ta'ala made another promise, one that we remember, we memorize as kids. Inna shaniyaka huwal abtar. Ya Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, not you, but your enemy will die without any progeny. We talk about impatience because it takes too long for something to happen. This ayat was revealed in 614. After Ikrama had been born, when Abu Jahl was strong, when the Muslims were weak. A skeptic, a doubter would have let that disconnect set in. There's no way that what the Qur'an is saying right now is going to happen. This is just impossible. But nearly 2 decades after that ayat's promise was revealed, those same skeptics saw the power of that ayat. Because by the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's passing, the following people from Abu Jahl's family alone had become Muslim. His mother Asma, his daughter Juwairiya, his sister Harmala and her 2 children, his nephew, the great Khalid bin Walid, all 13 children and grandchildren of his sister Ahantama, almost the entire lineage of his paternal uncle Walid bin Mughira, his maternal nephew Hisham bin al-As, and his niece Hakim, the same Hakim who eventually married Abu Jahl's greatest nephew, Hazrat Umar. Basically, Abu Jahl's entire family either became Muslim or disappeared into the ether, like the Quran promised decades earlier. Inna shaniyaka huwal abtar. But as But as painful as this would have been if it had Abu Jahl known, I think that he would have actually been hurt more by the legacy that Ikrama left. Many of us know the gist of the following story, that at Yarmouk, at the Battle of Yarmouk, 3 Sahaba laying dying. So one sahabi asked for water. When the water is brought to him, he says, give it to the sahabi next to me. The second sahabi says, give it to the third. But by the time the water gets to the third sahabi, he's passed away. And then the second sahabi's offered the water, he's passed away. And then the first he's offered the water, and he's also passed away. So we know this much, generally speaking, but what we may not know is that these 3 Sahaba were Abu Jahl's brother, Harith bin Hisham, Abu Jahl's half-brother, Ayash bin Rabia, and Abu Jahl's firstborn, Hazrat Ikrama, all dying of wounds after helping secure a Muslim victory. And Ikrama's legacy isn't just about his transformation or his legendary death. It's also about Allah Ta'ala covering up his faults. In a 2015 khutbah, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis, Ayyadahullah Ta'ala bin Nasr al-Aziz, mentioned that the attribute of as-Sattar has the quality of not only erasing sins, but actually making people forget that the wrongdoer committed the sin in the first place. Besides the fact that we should cover people's faults, the other reason I didn't really mention any wrongdoing of Ikrama with specificity in this speech is because history barely records it. Allah's Sattariyat has actually covered it up. And the wrongs that Muslims everywhere do mention obviously aren't mentioned so we can criticize him or look down upon him. It's so that we can celebrate the fact that he got over his disconnect. Like Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam promised his father decades earlier, if you accept the Qur'an, you would humble the Arabs and dominate the non-Arabs. That's power, that's legacy, that's the life-giving promise of the Holy Qur'an. So we come full circle. We can treat the Qur'an like Abu Jahl or like Ikrama. But whatever we do, we should know that this will definitely affect our legacy. And this is not my logic. Actually, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, many of you may have been present, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih mentioned this in his last khutbah of the US tour. He said, अगर अपने घरों के माहौल को कुरान करीम की तालीम के मुताबिक ढालने की कोशिश ना की तो हमारी औलादें और नस्लें दीन से दूर होती जाएंगी. If we do not strive to shape the environment in our homes according to the teachings of the Holy Quran, our children and progenies will become distant from Islam. My brother in faith, respected Sardar Majlis Khuddam al-Ahmadiyya USA, recently mentioned to me that Hazur assigned Majlis Khuddam al-Ahmadiyya USA this year the theme of the Holy Quran, a guiding light. So let's treat it that way. Let's experience that 1% by reading the Quran daily and by treating the Quran like a guiding light, just like Ikrama. Let's not be like those people who say we believe in the Quran, but let some kind of disconnect get in the way. A disconnect about which Hazrat Masih Maud himself says the following, and with which I close. उनकी ऐसी मिसाल है कि एक शख्स को मालूम है कि फ़लाँ चश्मा नहायती मुसफ़्फ़ा व शीरीन और खुनक है और उसके पानी बहुत से अमराज के वास्ते इक्सीर और शिफा है. ये इल्म उसको यकीनी है, लेकिन बावजूद इस इल्म के और बावजूद प्यासा होने और बहुत से अमराज में मुब्तला होने के वो उसके पास नहीं जाता. तो ये उसकी कैसी बदकिस्मती और जहालत है. उस शख्स की हालत बहुत ही इबरत बख्श और नसीहत खेज़ है. Their example is like a person who knows about who was talking about the Quran here. Their example is like a person who knows about a pure, cool, sweet spring and knows that its water can cure many illnesses. He knows this for certain, but despite knowing this and despite being thirsty and suffering from many illnesses, he does not go near it. This is his misfortune and jahalat. Such a person's condition is most ominous, cautionary. Assalamu alaikum.
sallallahu alaihi wasallam.